The World Beyond the Headlines lecture series is a project of the University of Chicago Center for International Studies.
Hello, everybody. Good evening. So, welcome. My name is Orit Bashkin. I'm a historian of the modern Middle East in the Near Eastern Languages and Civilization Department at this university. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to this evening's lecture by Jodi Rudoren, who will be speaking on journalism in the land of two facts. Before turning to introduce Jodi in full, allow me to mention that today's talk is part of the Center for International Studies World Behind the Headlines series, with generous co-sponsorship from the New York Times in Education, and also the Center for Middle Eastern Studies, the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilization, the Center for Jewish Studies, the Institute of Politics, and the Jerusalem Study Abroad program, which is an overseas program that we do every spring. We send students to Jerusalem to study the history of Jerusalem in Jerusalem. World Beyond the Headlines features acclaimed journalists, scholars, newsmakers, offering in-depth perspectives on matters of public concern. Tonight's talk completes the series winter quarter lineup, but World Beyond the Headlines returns in the spring on April 17th with journalist and Pulitzer Center grantee Misha Fink, I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly, presenting his documentary, The Abominable Crime, on LGBT activism in the Caribbean. And there's more information on the website, the Center for International Studies at uchicago.edu. Now to tonight's speakers. Jodi Rudoren has been Jerusalem Bureau Chief of the New York Times since May 2012, covering Israel, the Palestinian territories, and Jordan during the time of regional turmoil. She spent 10 days. When I introduced her to my class, I said 10 years. It's 10 days in the Gaza Strip during Israel's Operation Pillar of Defense in 2012. She covered the Israeli election and President Obama's visit the following spring. She did a project on Palestinian teenagers who throw stones and another on Syrian refugee children. And she has written extensively on the Middle East peace process, Israel's internal identity debates, and the Iranian nuclear threat. More recently, she covered the death of Ariel Sharon. During 15 years at the Times, Jodi has served as deputy Metro editor, where she created a new Sunday local feature section and executive produced the Emmy Award-winning multimedia series 1 in 8 Million. Chicago Bureau Chief, where she wrote news and features while roaming around 11 Midwestern states. A national education correspondent, where she specialized in school choice and affirmative action. Jodi also covered the 2004 presidential campaign, following first Howard Dean and then John Kerry. Born in Newton, Massachusetts, Jodi earned a degree in history from Yale University in 1992. She taught advanced journalism at the New School University and served on the boards of Yale Alumni Magazine and Oldest College Daily Foundation, which publishes the Yale News. She lives in Jerusalem with her husband, Gary, an architect, a comedy writer, theater director, and photographer, and their 6-year-old twins. Formerly, she and her husband combined their surnames in 2006. So The Jewish Daily Forward included Jodi in the list of the world's 50 most influential Jews in 2012. And I had the pleasure actually of having her speaking to my class today, and I already got emails thanking me about how wonderful it is to actually hear something from people who actually cover the events and not just sort of the facts that we repeat from textbooks about the conflict. I'm very thankful personally. And speaking of facts, again, it gives me great pleasure to introduce to you Jodi. Welcome.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me. It's really great to be back in Chicago and back on a university campus and back in America and back among the snow, although we had a taste of that in Jerusalem in December also. I'm going to see if I can do, yes, there we are. Okay. If you're not in the right place, you can leave now if you want. Anyway, it's really fun to be back and to be talking to students, and I see we have some actual grown-ups here as well, which is great. It's always fun to talk about my beat and these issues because the audience is generally very well informed and very passionate about the subject. So I hope I'll talk for a bit and then take a lot of your questions so that we can focus the conversation where you want it and have a conversation. I'm trying, I'm not so hip to PowerPoint, but I'm trying. Okay, so we're going to do this first, right? Okay. As Orit mentioned, I have 6-year-old twins, and they generally wake me up every day around 6 o'clock by jumping on me in bed, and I then grab my phone and check to see if anything has happened overnight, whether anything actually happened. Is that like Israeli bomber jets coming, or? Okay. Anyway, and I mean both whether anything's actually happened or whether editors in New York have some crazy idea that they've had in my overnight that I need to check on. And a few weeks ago, or maybe 6 weeks ago, the first thing I saw was this picture. Would a great newspaper slant the news, misrepresenting facts, omitting key information, skewing headlines and photos? And in my admittedly groggy state, my first thought was, I wonder which side put up this banner across from my office in New York. It's like a 4-story banner. I'm going there tomorrow, so I'll see it in person. And I should have known actually that it was CAMRA, the Committee for Accuracy in Middle East Reporting, which is probably the best funded of my critics. And oh wait, let's go. Sorry, we're not gonna do this throughout the talk, but. So the tweet, I guess, was propaganda reporter looking to bury the Jewish state of Israel. So I guess I should have known because they are like the best funded of my critic. But they're not the only ones. I have active critics of my work on both sides of the issue, or all sides of the issue, I guess. And so sometimes I'm called a self-hating anti-Zionist Jew bent on demonizing Israel, looking to bury the Jewish state of Israel. And other times I'm called the hopeless tool for the Zionist propaganda sheet, the Jewish newspaper, New York Times, who's entrenched in West Jerusalem culture and West Jerusalem narrative promoting apartheid, fascist Israel. So I'm always flattered by the attention. It's humbling to do work that is so closely followed and scrutinized by people. I've written about 300,000 words about this conflict and these places since I arrived almost 2 years ago, and most of them have been parsed and deconstructed and lambasted at great length. But what I've come to understand is that all this attention and scrutiny and criticism and discussion of my work really has almost nothing to do with me or with my work at all. And it's really about the folks who are writing these screeds about my work and about what they think about the underlying conflict and issues. And while it's really about advancing a narrative. And so the Committee for Accuracy in Middle East Reporting, I think, is really a committee for advocating Middle East reporting that supports its view of the Middle East. And that is totally fine with me. People have every right to advocate whatever they want. But I think what's interesting is, well, I'll get back to that in a second. Anyway, I wanted to also, so you saw the name of this talk, right? We came up with the name of this talk, Journalism in a Land of Few Facts. And those words also did not go without scrutiny. So it's not just the articles that I write in the actual newspaper that get scrutinized, but the name of the talk was criticized by one of my big fans who lives in Chicago and may well be here, Ali Abunimah of the Electronic Intifada. And he wrote a letter of complaint to the New York Times public editor about the title of the talk. And he wrote, Palestine, I would assert, is not a land of few facts, but a land of few international journalists with the courage to state the facts. And on Sunday, I was on campus as well at the Hillel House, I think down the street from here. And the Hillel director also asked me about the title of the talk. And she said that she thought that this was not, the land I cover is not a land of too few facts, but in fact, a land of too many facts, a land of disputed facts. And I said that I thought that was part of what that title was actually intended to say, because I think what we have here is, when I say few facts, what I mean is few sort of axiomatic facts, few facts that are not in dispute, few facts that are not part of the dueling narratives that really define everything that we cover and everything that's going on in this place. In Ali Abunimah's letter to the public editor, he referred several times to Palestine, and even that is, of course, a fact or an opinion. I'm not sure. Where's Palestine exactly? I wrote a column recently for the International Edition about a new movie called Peace After Marriage. I don't know if anyone has seen it. It's this movie by a Palestinian American in Brooklyn, a romantic comedy about a Palestinian 30-year-old whose parents are desperate for him to get married, and he's kind of a sex addict. Anyway, he arranges a green card marriage, thinking that this will get him some action, and the green card marriage is with an Israeli, and this sort of freaks everybody out, and he's telling his parents about it, and the parents say, is she from Palestine? And he says, we call it Palestine, she doesn't. And that was in the trailer, so I haven't ruined anything for you. But anyway, it occurred to me as I was reading the Ali Abunimah's letter that even in this kind of 3-paragraph letter, he was, reflecting his own perspective on the facts, and that those facts are not without dispute or debate, and that in itself is really part of the conundrum that the title was intended to evoke and to provoke discussion about. As I was saying earlier, the scrutiny of my work is really not just of my work. Ali Abunimah also tweeted recently, I was at a conference and checked my phone and saw this tweet that said, NY Times' @Rudoren's husband posts on Facebook about, quote, making aliyah, and then in parentheses, becoming racially privileged settler in Palestine. And then a few minutes later, he tweeted, while @Rudoren husband revels in his racial privilege, Palestinian refugees can only dream of seeing Jerusalem. So I was at this conference. I'd actually stayed over in Tel Aviv the night before, and I thought, what has he done now? My husband posting about making aliyah, which struck me as quite shocking because, most of all, because I know he has no interest in making aliyah, but also he's quite aware that he needs to watch his Facebook posts a little bit. So I clicked on the link to his Facebook post to see what it was, and it said the following. It said, the day that they allow citizens to hand out parking tickets to idiotic, inconsiderate parkers is the day I might make aliyah in celebration. Those of you who have tried to park in Jerusalem might appreciate that humor. And I mean, I think objective readers, or really any readers, would recognize this as a joke. And you might especially think that if you knew that he had authored a book called Comedy by the Numbers. But Ali Abunimah is not an objective reader, and Camera is not an objective reader or analyst. They're advocates. They are passionate advocates in this conflict. And we have, surrounding this conflict, many, many truly passionate advocates for their position. And I think that's one of the things that attracted me to this job, is that people of great passion and great intellect in many ways and great compassion in many ways are in a death fight over very important things. That not only are they passionate advocates, which we have kind of on every issue of public policy, but they're passionate advocates on an issue that is at the core of their identity. And the narrative that they are promoting is not just something they kind of think, it's not like a policy position, it's essential to kind of who they are and how they live. And so I think that passionate advocacy, and it's particularly the way that plays into narratives and the entrenched identity, is what makes the scrutiny of, what makes the reporting in a land of few facts so difficult, but also what makes the possibilities for change in the region so challenging as well and difficult. I want to be clear that I don't subscribe to the view that if you're pissing everybody off, you must be doing something right, which is something that I think a lot of people say about journalists. That's not my point. It's not that because both sides seem to hate me and my work, I must be a success. Although my parents think so. But anyway, what I think it means is that it's not about me or about what I write, but people are using me and what I write, or what my husband writes on Facebook, as an opportunity to promote their narrative, which is part of advocacy, I suppose, but I think is not incredibly helpful either to the journalism in this place or to the I guess, resolution of the conflict that's at the core of this beat. Well, another kind of piece, last week I had a piece about Prime Minister Netanyahu having called the boycott, the growing boycott of Israel and Israeli settlement products, he had called it immoral. And I was really struck by that word choice, because a boycott seems like such a pure kind of political tool and has such a sort of illustrious history, from abolitionists to the bus boycott to apartheid. And also, even just on a day-to-day level, when you think, I don't like the way this coffee shop treats their workers, so I'm going to go across the street, this kind of voting with your wallet idea, it seems like a very pure tool. So I thought, well, what could possibly be immoral about it? And so I wanted to explore this a little bit and write about what that meant, why he said it, what he meant by it, how resonant it was. And what I found out was that what he was talking about was that it was the sort of presumption or accusation or fear that the boycott was not a boycott based on policy, but was a boycott based on persona, that it was a boycott of Israel because it was anti-Semitic, because it was a boycott of Jews. And that this sort of reminded, the word boycott, well, for me, it was the Montgomery bus boycott or the divestment movement and apartheid, that for him and for many Israelis, it brought the first image that comes to mind is the Nazi boycott in the 1930s, where Jewish businesses in Europe and then elsewhere were boycotted. So I wrote that piece. Anyway, so there were some tweets that said, anti-BDS quotes, 135 words, 4 people. Pro-BDS quotes, 59 words, 1 person. Anti-BDS views, 430 words. Pro-BDS views, 182 words. That was the parsing of that article, which I think was 690 some words altogether, because it's this very small piece. And when I read that, I just thought, this is so missing the point. I mean, first of all, this idea that it was 4 people quoted on one side and 1 person quoted on the other side was kind of ridiculous, since they counted Prime Minister Netanyahu, whose quote was the word immoral, and that was actually the platform for the whole piece. It was not like a quote in the piece. That was counted as a person who was anti-BDS. And then also these counting up of this article was not even like BDS good or bad, it was immoral as a descriptor, what is that about? So this pro-BDS, anti-BDS was like not even something I was ever thinking about. If anything, it was pro-immoral as a description versus, is a boycott immoral? Yes or no? And in that case, there was an Israeli quoted in the piece saying boycotts are totally moral and we should in fact respond to this boycott with a boycott of our own. So I wouldn't count him as anti either, because the point wasn't, are you for BDS? It was, is the boycott immoral? So in any case, this is kind of what the day-to-day debate is around my stories. And I think it creates a really toxic environment to work in. But I think probably more importantly, a toxic environment for people who are trying to work on the actual problems as opposed to just cover them. Some of you probably know Khalil Shakaki, who's probably the leading Palestinian pollster and political analyst, and he teaches at Brandeis. He recently co-authored, I think it's just coming out, a new textbook with an Israeli professor and an Egyptian. I think it's the first of its kind. And he was showing it to me, and he said, it has facts, fiction, and analysis, and 3 sections. And the fiction he was talking about was these dueling narratives that Palestinians and Israelis have about their history and about their reality, their day-to-day reality. These dueling narratives, again, not only mess with mainstream journalism, which is not that important, but they do make, I think, the conflict itself, it's part of what has made it so intractable and really affect the talks. And the peace talks that are now entering their 3rd trimester. I guess they're pretty deep into their 3rd trimester by now. And I think as you think about what's happening with those peace talks and on the ground in general, probably the most important question I see is whether the discussion is focused on the future or the past. I think when the discussion is focused on the past, who did what to who, whose claim to the land is older or deeper, or whose God is the true God, I think that's all terrain that looks to me like irreconcilable differences. I don't know how you're ever gonna, the level of, again, identity-based narrative is so strong, and the essence of those narratives are so deeply in conflict that I find it hard to imagine how there's much room for progress there. But I do think that if the talks become more pragmatic and more future-oriented, more about drawing lines on a map and making arrangements for 2 peoples to sort of interact for economic cooperation or for security arrangements and for sharing natural resources, it seems to me that there's some possibilities there, and that's where, you know, the Americans might have a chance to make a difference here. It's relatively easy for me as an outsider, and I think in some ways for Secretary Kerry as an outsider, and maybe for many of you as outsiders, to imagine a process and an agreement in which you could acknowledge the 2 narratives and give legitimacy to both histories and say, like, these terrible things have happened. Both peoples have serious, legitimate claims to this land, the same land, and acknowledge that the sharing of the land in a kind of, you know, real side-by-side, we're together in one state way is something nobody really wants, and then say, so how do we split it up and make a pragmatic plan for moving forward from here? I think it's, as I said, I think it's relatively easy for an outsider who's not, who understands the 2 narratives but is not kind of defined by them to see a possibility there. I don't know whether folks who are living in the narrative are going to ever be able to get focused more on the pragmatic future and less on the past. But I do think that's kind of where the opening might be. I think probably the best, for me, the most potent example of that is this thing that has been an increasing focus in the last few months, the Israeli demand for recognition by the Palestinians of Israel as the Jewish state, or as they like to say, the nation state of the Jewish people, or the homeland of the Jewish people. You've probably heard some about this in the last few months. And as you know, this is a relatively new issue. It's been talked about before as a kind of minor back burner thing that might be included at the end of an agreement. But in the last few months, it's become clear that Prime Minister Netanyahu has elevated it to be a core issue as never before. And that has led to a lot of people saying he's doing this to actually scuttle the talks. He's doing this because he knows it will never be agreed to by the Palestinians. They've been very clear that they will not agree to it up until this point. What he says as an explanation for why he thinks this is so important is that the only way to assure Israelis and himself that this is really the end of the conflict, the end of all claims, that the Palestinian state would not be used as a proxy to and the state of Israel is for there to be an acknowledgement that it's really two states for two peoples, and that the people that own the Israeli state, I guess, are the Jewish people, and that it is therefore the homeland of the Jewish people, or the Jewish state, or you can formulate it many ways. What we've heard on the Palestinian side is a bunch of things. The first things that they mostly said about this new demand is, look, nobody ever asked Jordan and Egypt to recognize the Jewishness of the state. Why are you asking us to do that? And then further, they've said, you don't need us to recognize you. If you want to change your name, go to the United Nations like Gaddafi did, and he made it the Great Socialist People's Libyan Arab Jamahiriya. If you want to be the nation state of the Maccabees, you can. Just go to the United Nations. They're in charge of that. Those were kind of the first lines of defense. And then there's been talk of the way recognizing Israel as the Jewish state would affect the Palestinian minority in Israel, the citizens, and also would affect the right of return. Those two things seem to me, and if you're using your pragmatic, future-oriented frame, you could imagine some language that would say, we're going to deal with the refugee issue, we're going to deal with the Arab Israelis. Those issues have always been on the table. And we're going to, I don't think they necessarily conflicts with the recognition. There's a way to kind of separate those things. But then the thing that I've also heard from the Palestinians, and this is what I'm watching most closely, is when they've said, the reason we can't recognize Israel as the Jewish state is because that involves denying our narrative and embracing a Zionist narrative. And that, of course, is language of the past. And it seems to me that it makes perfect sense if you're talking about a declaration that Israel has always been the homeland of the Jewish people, or that this particular side of the border, some future border, has always been the homeland of the Jewish people. But it occurs to me, and I think this is where the Americans are heading with their framework, is isn't there a way to say Israel is now, from this agreement, the home of the Jewish people, or the nation state, or whatever they want to say, and Palestine is the home of the Palestinian people. And this, of course, does have implications for the refugee question, but I think you could imagine language that was future-oriented and that didn't try to address anybody's narrative, and didn't ask, as Saeb Erekat has said, I will never deny my history, and I'm from Jericho, I've always been. I don't think that the basic thing that the Israelis are asking necessarily demands that he denies his history, but the fact that they've been framing the issue that way so far raises to me also the same question that's been raised about Netanyahu's demand, is this a way to make the talks impossible? So we'll see how that comes out. We do expect that the framework will be presented in the next couple weeks, and it is expected to include some kind of language on recognition, as well as on the 1967 lines, some reference to something about Jerusalem as a capital of Palestine, and a security plan, and nobody really knows what it will say about refugees, but it will clearly say something about refugees. The framework is if it happens, will be absolutely a significant achievement that John Kerry will be quite proud of, and should be quite proud of. But I think it's important to remember that, I'm going to just take off my sweater if you guys don't mind, that we were having actually almost the identical conversation that we're having right now back in June, when we were talking about getting these talks restarted again. Back then, everybody thought that the Americans were going to present a term sheet, a terms of reference for the talks. Palestinians and Israelis were going to be allowed to express reservations or not sign on to the paper, and this was going to set out what the talks would be about. And now here we are 7 months later, basically having the exact same conversation. They're calling it a framework now, but it's essentially terms of reference for the continuation of talks, and the Palestinians and Israelis are going to be allowed to express their reservations. So it's not nothing, but it essentially, one of the things that it will be, if it happens, is an acknowledgement that basically nothing has happened in the last 7 months. They've had 20 meetings in which they made no progress. Now they've stopped having meetings with each other and are only having meetings with the Americans. And this will be an extension of a 9-month round of negotiations, probably through 2014. And it will lay out the core principles for a final status agreement, which I think everyone in this room could probably tell you what those core principles are. Certainly they're not hard to find on Wikipedia or whatever. The assessment of what John Kerry achieved by getting the two parties back into talks in July was essentially that it was a significant achievement and that it was due to his perseverance and diligence and commitment, but that it was the first in 1,000, or as my kids might say, 100,000 steps. And I think that's where we'll be if he gets the framework, is that it will be a significant achievement to have kept them in the room under significant political pressures on both sides. And you can't do anything without them in the room, but at the same time, the gaps remain very wide, and it does not necessarily mean, a historic peace is around the corner. So much has happened in the 22 months that I've been on this beat. Orit mentioned several of the things, this war in Gaza, the Israeli elections, Palestinian municipal elections, a lot of movement on the Israeli side about the question, a lot of discussion at least, about the question of the ultra-Orthodox serving in the military and integrating better into the workforce. The group Women of the Wall has had its kind of moment, and a lot of discussion about pluralism in Jewish public spaces in Israel. There's been a coup, or maybe not a coup, in Egypt. Many, many people have died in Syria, and many more have fled Syria for the surrounding countries. Iraq has begun to fall apart at the seams. Rouhani has been elected in Iran, and of course the P5+1 negotiated an interim deal and then delayed it, and now has moved forward with it. There was supposedly a rapprochement between Israel and Turkey, which has yet to actually come to fruition, but we'll see. And as Orit mentioned, President Obama made his historic visit to Jerusalem and to Ramallah and Bethlehem in March, and Secretary Kerry has made historic visits pretty much every other week since then. The question, of course, is whether anything has actually changed. And that's a much more difficult question. The news in Israel and Palestine is like this ferociously moving circle spinning on its axis. Tons of stuff happening, most of it happening over and over again. We have the example of the release of Palestinian prisoners, followed by the announcement of settlement construction. We've seen 3 rounds of that so far. We've got another one coming up in March. And on a much bigger scale, just most of what happens there every single day is something that has happened there many, many times before. And so my big job is to try to figure out whether this rapidly spinning circle is inching to the right or to the left or up or down or about to fall apart somehow. And then the other big challenge is to try to find new ways to tell even this old and familiar story, to try to find new ways to explain it that might shed more light on the underlying issues, or might bring to light some new ripple in the story, or in the stories of the daily life of people in these places. And I think for people who want to affect change in this region, they similarly have this challenge of trying to get into this kind of, as I said, very fast spinning, fast moving, noisy chaos of seemingly news, and to try to push the circle in one direction or another, while of course other people are trying to push it in the opposite direction. And it's definitely a challenge, unlike any one I've had in my career. I think it's absolutely the most complicated journalism job around, and probably the most complicated peace task for Secretary Kerry, and just one of the most complicated political tasks for anyone who wants to affect change there. It's the problems there are deep, they are foundational, and I think the word intractable was probably invented for this conflict. I think I might stop there and take your questions, and then there's lots more to talk about, but maybe I can just do it through your questions. Yeah? Oh, I'm sorry, they're recording this, and so they really want you to speak into this microphone.
Thank you. Two-part question. In terms of your discussion of, it's like a circle, the same stuff comes around and goes around all the time. In the instance that you have 480 accredited journalists in a very tiny country, in a city of less than 1 million, do you think there's a possibility that the demands of your own news organizations are such that you are news makers versus news reporters, one? And two, out of that group of persons from around the world, 480 or so, why is it that there seems to be no concern about the legitimacy of the Palestinian areas in terms of nobody wants to live there? The journalists seem to avoid living there, Ramallah, Gaza, Bethlehem. Can you address those?
Sure. I had heard 800 journalists. Is it 480 now?
480 accredited.
No, it must have, once upon a time it must have been 800. So it's shrinking, which we know. People have closed their bureaus. You know, it's funny. People often sort of jokingly say, if peace breaks out, you know, how long will we all stay here, and how many bureaus will be left after that? It's an interesting question that it would be nice to have to confront. Well, one thing I'll say is I've been struck by the incredible appetite for stories about this place. I think the New York Times is not normal in this way. I think we probably cover this place more aggressively and more extensively than pretty much anyone else. But I feel like, you know, my colleagues have problems sometimes getting in the paper, having stories held for a long time, and I do not. Sometimes I'll have some great feature story that we've written that's supposed to run, and then a bunch of news stuff will happen that day, and we'll think, oh, I guess that'll get held, and they'll just run all 3 stories out of here, and we're just constantly surprised. So I'm not sure I know the answer of why that is, and sometimes it's funny, we lose our own perspective. When Israel was having trouble replacing Stanley Fischer as the governor of the Bank of Israel, it was kind of this ongoing running story in Israel for days. And I kept sort of checking in with my colleague, Isabel Kirshner, about whether we needed to write about it. And she just was like, do you have any idea who the governor of the bank of anywhere else is? Like, in what way is this an international story? Who is the governor of the Bank of Argentina? Would we ever write a story about that? And she often has to kind of remind me that this is not actually, the 6th borough of New York. And, but we do kind of cover it like a local story. And I think there are a few reasons for that. One is that it's so intrinsically connected to Washington and to foreign policy, to American foreign policy. And so it's kind of an axis of our big coverage of the White House and Congress and, the whole kind of American political and foreign policy agenda. I think the daily politics of Israel in particular is really enmeshed in that. And so part of that is one thing. I think also, people have an intense level of interest, particularly in Israel. Things that have nothing to do with the conflict also. And I suppose there's some amount of this kind of cyclical thing too, that it sort of ever has been thus, and maybe, it's funny because people are getting kind of exhausted of this story, especially there's all this other, and we have been pushed inside a lot by Syria and Egypt and Iran, I think. I think, as the Middle East has heated up in the last few years and the axes have sort of shifted, our role at the paper and the level of importance of this beat has definitely changed. The question of where we live is a really, I think, an important and interesting one. And it's not, I think you make a perfectly fine point, but there are some caveats to it, because I think there are more journalists living in Ramallah now, I think, than there were. Not for big mainstream news organizations, really, but I think there are more Western, at least freelancers, and some working for some pretty serious online publications who are based in Ramallah. And a couple living in Bethlehem also, but more Ramallah. And we all also work with people who live in either East Jerusalem or the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. I mean, we have a correspondent in the Gaza Strip who we rely on, a ton. And we got some. I heard a little bit about this when we were first moving, when I was first going. Why doesn't the New York Times have a bureau in Ramallah? And it's a fine question. And I think, first of all, I think it's important to know that within this beat, I don't think I was as clear on this before I went. I remember saying something to some interviewer or something that I was going to live in West Jerusalem, but I was going to compensate for that by spending as much time as possible in East Jerusalem and the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. And I tried to spend half my time doing stories in those areas and about Palestinian life. And that was just a total joke. I'm nowhere near close to that. I don't spend anywhere near enough time there. But it was also just fantasy to imagine that the job really is some kind of 50-50 job. Because as I said, if coverage of even the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, if we succeeded in covering that in a kind of 50-50 way, there's all this other stuff about Israel that is a really big part of our coverage and of our readers' interest and our editors' interest, which has to do with Israeli policies on Iran, Syria, Egypt, other regional issues, and then sort of Jewish life there, and the Haredim issue, the Women of the Wall issue, things that have nothing to do with the Palestinians, really, that are a huge part of our coverage. And I don't think I understood that as fully. I don't think the New York Times has ever really considered putting its bureau in Ramallah. I think Ramallah is in terms of a lot of the decisions about where to place a bureau has to do with access to other places. And Ramallah is not a particularly easy place to get in and out of, which is of course part of the problem. My feeling about this is that it is what it is, and we should be really upfront about it and work to compensate about it, but not pretend that it's not true. I think one of the more potent criticisms of me has been something that Phil Weiss has written a lot, which is that I think he's off in the way he says it, but he talks about that I live in West Jerusalem and that I'm therefore entrenched in that culture. And I think particularly because I'm a young parent, I do spend most of my off time is in West Jerusalem or in Israel and not in the Palestinian territories, and I think that's too bad. I think that I should do as much as I can to kind of work against that. But it's like also, it's just a daily struggle to make it work. You're kidding me, really? Should I just blab on? I got more to say, yeah.
So you talked a lot about how, especially at the beginning, how you have like people coming at you from all sides, parsing your words constantly. So how do you sift through what's actually legitimate for you to pay attention to and what's like a criticism or a mistake that you have to take into account in the future? Yeah,
good question. I've always thought it was really important to engage readers and to engage critics, and that throughout the 2004 campaign, I responded to every email I got from a reader, and I started this beat doing that as well. And I really found in my 20 years of doing this that almost always engagement and responding to readers was really constructive. People kind of, the New York Times is sort of a big, scary institution, kind of like the University of Chicago, and people would write letters to it thinking it was this faceless, nameless thing, and when they'd get a response from an actual person, they would be quite touched that someone had taken time, and then would engage on a much more kind of constructive, thoughtful level because they were really dealing with a person. I found that to be much less true in this beat. I did begin by responding to everybody. I do it a little bit less now when it's really clear to me that it's a ginned up campaign by an organization and people are just repeating the same stuff. I sort of stopped doing it, mostly because I also know that my first response is getting circulated or published somewhere. I don't respond to people who use a lot of profanity or comment on my looks, which I get pretty much every time. So on one level, there's just the question of basic engagement. Again, I think it just has become clearer and clearer to me that it actually is not about media criticism or engagement or improving the work. It's just really about undermining credibility and sort of a gotcha process. We have a very religious commitment to correcting any errors of fact. So I scrutinize every email I get for any accusation of an error of fact, and then I look into any error of fact. And as any of you who have followed this know, I've made a lot of errors, and we've corrected them all, and I'm not proud of any one of them. But I think that it's really bad to make mistakes. Credibility is the whole ball of wax for journalists, and so every error of fact is a big problem. I don't think that the idea that errors of fact add up to kind of some conspiracy to promote some agenda holds any water. But I think your question raises for me a larger kind of conundrum that I face. Because there's this whole, the New York Times has about 30 million readers of its website. And most of those people don't know anything about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. They've never been to Israel or Palestine or Jordan or Syria or any of those places. And they really rely on me and my colleagues to tell them what's going on in these places. They don't subscribe to, newsletters from AIPAC, or they don't read the Electronic Intifada. They don't have, 10 other sources of information. And a lot of the people who are writing me emails and tweeting about my work do have all these, they get all their information from other sources. They read 14, Israeli or Palestinian websites online. They go there all the time. They maybe live there, they whatever. And their engagement with my work is for a different agenda. So I try to remember that while those people are quite loud and, have my boss's email address, which is a little uncomfortable, they're not really the audience. I mean, they're not few of them, but they're not 30 million either. And I just want to remember kind of what the point is. And the point really is not to change the mind of someone who is devoting their life to this cause, or even to really, I just don't think they have that much use for me. And I think the real point is so that people in far-flung places who care about this will find out more about it. But this plays out in a couple of ways in terms, so I just try really hard not to spend my whole life writing defensively about what am I going to be attacked for in this piece. Because the truth is, even if I did that, I just don't think I would do it right. Because this recent thing with the immoral column is, I thought I was writing about something completely different from what they thought I was writing about. I thought I was sort of unmasking this Israeli obsession with the Holocaust, essentially. And I had no idea that what they said I was doing was comparing BDS to the Nazis, which is I don't know what they're talking about. It's just not in the piece. I just think it's because that's what they come to the piece with. They bring it to that piece. So, but what I was going to bring up is something I call conflict code. There's this whole, there's a bunch of language and words that mean different things in English and in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And so I first got familiar with this. I'd been there only a few weeks, so I did this small little feature story about a sheikh in Hebron who had set up a peace tent outside of Hebron and was kind of having talks of his own with some settlers, and then there were these visiting European parliamentarians who had come. We were all sitting on the floor, and he was chain smoking, and they were talking about how a sort of one-state solution kind of thing. Anyway, so the lead of the piece was, peace talks between Palestinians and Israelis resumed this week in an elaborate tent off a dirt road south of this hotly disputed city where Abraham, the patriarch of both peoples, is believed to have buried his wife. So does anyone know what's wrong with that sentence? I'll read it one more time. Peace talks between Palestinians and Israelis resumed this week in an elaborate tent off a dirt road south of this hotly disputed city where Abraham, the patriarch of both peoples, is believed to have buried his wife. The dateline was Hebron. Anyone? Joe? Is Abraham not the patriarch? No, he is, thankfully. Yes? No, but good guess. Yes? No. It's not a, okay. Yes? They weren't the actual peace talks? No, that was the joke, but yes, no, that's not what's wrong with it, yes. This is encouraging that you don't know, yes? Okay, I'll give it to you. No, it's not. So it's the word disputed, okay? Does anyone know what's wrong with the word disputed? What's not disputed? Okay, no. I said it was a hotly disputed city. So what's wrong with saying something that it's a hotly disputed city? Orit, you know. Tell me, Orit, what is wrong with it? What does disputed mean? Controversial. What does disputed mean? Anyone?
Arabs and the Israelis live in separate parts of the city.
Right. It's just the word disputed. Does anyone know what's wrong with the word disputed? This is so encouraging. Okay. So disputed is what people who do not admit that the territories are occupied call the territories. Okay? So if you don't acknowledge the occupation, you would call the West Bank disputed territory. Okay? Now this piece, later in the piece, talked about occupation. Okay, so I wasn't saying it was disputed as opposed to occupied. I was saying it was a hotly disputed city because, anybody know? I mean, Hebron is among the most hotly disputed cities in the territory. So within the West Bank, which is occupied territory, Hebron is a place that has had particularly hot disputes. You know, people get killed there all the time, and settlers and Palestinians are living very close to each other. There's like literally a street where they live across the street from each other, and there are 10 Israeli soldiers stationed to keep them from killing each other. It's in hot contention. So I discovered that disputed was an illegal word in conflict code, even though it's a perfectly understandable word in English, which is the language I thought I was writing in. So, okay, so I kind of noted that. And then about 6 months later, after the Gaza war and after the Palestinians achieved non-member observer state status in the United Nations, which I think I forgot from my list of things that have happened but may not have changed anything, so I apologize. Anyway, after that, Israel talked about starting construction in this area called E1, which is right outside Ma'ale Adumim. You may have heard about this. It's for a long time been considered a very hotly disputed piece of the West Bank. So anyway, I wrote this very fast web story about this, and suddenly I click on the web to see if it's up, and I see that someone has written a headline referring to E1 as disputed territory. So I immediately called up New York and I said, you have to change the headline. You can't call it disputed. And you know, lesson learned. So we now call it contentious or something like that. And I think this is just, I don't know, it's a little silly. It's a little crazy because none of you who've actually come to a talk about this even know this. You thought disputed just meant something people are fighting over. And yet I'm sitting here worrying about, what I don't want to do is write so defensively for not even the people in this room, but the people, I don't know who, on Twitter or whatever. Forget about the people in India who, you know, really don't know much about this or whatever. Anyway, so I worry a little bit about writing too defensively. And this also comes up, we can play another little game, which I did in the class, but this also comes up in terms of how much background and context to provide in any individual news story. Because a lot of people would like, you know, it always comes up with Gaza. You know, we generally, so something happens, some rockets are fired from Gaza. I'm already in trouble by the way I've started this, and then Israel responds with an airstrike that kills somebody, and so then the lead of the story sort of wants to be about the most severe thing that happened, which is that somebody has been killed, but the Israelis are quite concerned that it's clear that they were sort of provoked by the rocket fire, but we want to know what happened before the rocket fire, what is it that maybe provoked the rocket fire, and you know, it kind of can go on and on. So the game I like to play is, does anyone know what actually started Operation Pillar of Defense, the 2012 8-day cross-border violence? What started that? Anyone? It's not Abraham. It's not fun if nobody guesses. No? Anyone? Orit? Okay. Nope. Well, anyway, okay. So a lot of people would answer the assassination of Ahmed al-Jabari, who was the head of the Qassam Brigades. And that happened on a Wednesday. And that was the first strike of the operation. It came, however, the Saturday before Hamas militants had fired an anti-tank missile at an army jeep patrolling the border, injuring 4 Israeli soldiers, and Israel responded, killing 5 Palestinians. That was on Saturday. The Jabari assassination was on Wednesday. Now, Israel had already absorbed 750 rockets from Gaza in 2012. This was now in November. And a few days before the Saturday, there was an 11-year-old kid in Gaza, a boy who was fatally struck by a bullet. That happened after Hamas set off a bomb against an Israeli force that Hamas said crossed the border. Okay, and a few days before that, Israel killed a 23-year-old man whose family had said that he was mentally ill, and this 23-year-old had crawled toward the border fence, concealed in a dry riverbed, so Israel had thought he was trying to attack. And of course, before that, there was the occupation starting in 1967, and before that, there was Israel becoming a state in 1948, and before that, there were the riots of 1929, and before that, there was the Balfour Declaration. And some people, I think, won't be satisfied unless every single story has sort of in the nut graph, Abraham had 2 sons, there was Isaac, and there was Ishmael, and that's where we begin. But again, I just wonder if the readers need all that, you know? And I know I don't have room for that in my 800-word story. So I try really hard to, first of all, I try incredibly hard to not make mistakes. And that's the most important thing. I do try a little bit to not give my critics softballs, you know, and to try to learn things like disputed and just avoid the obvious landmines. But I want to remind myself all the time that, you know, spending my life trying to avoid being criticized by people who are going to criticize me no matter what I write is not what they pay me all this incredible money for. So that was a long-winded answer, I'm sorry. Yeah.
You said that a lot of stories get written but not published.
No, I didn't say that.
Or they're held, or shall we say?
Yeah.
Okay. There have been headline front page articles for 5 months now in Israel and all over Europe, and not one word has been published in the New York Times about the Council of Europe.
About the what?
About the Council of Europe. Can you explain why the resolution from the Council of Europe is not discussed in the New York Times?
Nope. I don't know what that is. I don't know what you're talking about.
Well, 5 months ago, on October 1st, the Council of Europe passed a resolution stating that circumcising healthy boys is a clear violation of human rights. President Perez has made statements.
Oh, no, we did write a story about that.
It's not been published in the New York Times. There's virtually nothing in American media. It's all over Europe, it's all over Israel.
No, I mean, I've read it in Israeli press. I mean, and I've actually written to our Europe people and suggested that they write about it. I thought they did.
It's not.
Okay, I cannot explain it.
The Washington Post has published a couple of very brief articles, and Chicago Tribune, nothing. New York Times, nothing. I think Americans should be part of the discussion.
I agree, I guess. But I don't know the answer. Yeah.
Thank you for your presentation. I am a loyal reader of the New York Times, and I hope its financial troubles are resolved. It's a great newspaper. I don't follow this conflict so religiously as some of your critics, so I guess I'm sorry if this is kind of a basic question, but I think it would be fair to say that many of us on the left of center in the United States are somewhat skeptical of Prime Minister Netanyahu's commitment to the peace process, and one of the reasons that give people pause is these periodic settlement announcements that you've alluded to. So I guess I'm just wondering how might one square these announcements that are known to be inflammatory and incendiary to many with a kind of charitable view of his commitment to the peace process? Is the idea that they're just building in areas that will eventually be part of Israel anyway, or is something else going on? There's this reference to facts on the ground, but it's not clear what more facts there need to be when you already have hundreds of thousands of settlers in these territories. Thank you.
It's a good question. I think, Secretary Kerry really voiced this opinion or view, I think, quite articulately. I think it was in November, right? He did this joint interview with an Israeli and Palestinian television journalist, and he basically said the harshest thing any American has said about settlements in a long time, and he just basically said almost exactly what you said, which is, I just don't understand why you would keep building settlements in areas that we're talking about might not be, what it could possibly be the reason, type of thing. And it caused, quite an uproar. But I will say, I guess I'll try to answer that question and then maybe say something broader about this question of where is Netanyahu, which is what we all kind of want to know, right? They make a distinction between the blocks and outside the blocks. That is not a distinction that the Palestinians accept, and it's not a distinction that most of the world or the Americans really accept. But most of the time when we call them about when we're writing these stories, they, sometimes off the record and sometimes on the record, really say, it's in places that we believe will be in Israel no matter what. What difference does it make? It does not, they'll say something like, this will not affect the map at all to add these, to add 100 houses to a place that already has 10,000 people in it. And I think that, it's interesting, one of the things that was on the table about going to get them back into talks was the question of a freeze outside the blocks. And Netanyahu thinks that the settlement freeze of 2010 was, a colossal waste of effort. and that President Obama, totally misplayed his hand by kind of forcing a settlement freeze that he thinks lasted 10 months and then it went away, and like, what difference did it really make on the ground? The Palestinians really were completely opposed to the idea of a freeze outside the blocks because they don't want to, it's like giving up the blocks before you start the negotiations. So they didn't want to be drawing the map. They didn't want to, like, something that was supposed to be seen as some big victory for them, a freeze, would in fact take away part of their negotiating power on the map. But I think that Netanyahu was willing to freeze outside the blocks, and I think you might see a freeze outside the blocks after the framework, because if the framework, depending how clear the framework is on what the line might be, you can then imagine, so if you've agreed that this is the rough line, now you can have a freeze outside the blocks. It fits into your position more clearly. Anyway, I think that Netanyahu might have agreed to a freeze outside the blocks, partly to get more support for the blocks. Now, even what the blocks are is, of course, in dispute. But I think the Americans have kind of accepted at least Gush Etzion and Ma'ale Adumim. Netanyahu thinks that Ariel is clearly part of this bloc, which is much more in dispute. And then he recently said that he also sees Hebron and Beit El as part of Israel. So I don't, who knows really, but yeah. Oh, wait, let me just see if anyone else, because you've already asked me. Yeah.
Can you talk about how you prepared to move to Jerusalem and to cover the region?
Not enough. Yeah, so, I mean, first of all, I had no background in covering the Middle East at all, and I'd written a few stories about Muslim Americans after 9/11, because I was here based in the Midwest, so I did a lot of coverage in Michigan of the Arab American community there, which was not preparation for anything, but I'm just telling you that's something I did. Which also brings up somebody, this is kind of as an aside, so some of my critics unearthed an email that I wrote in 2001 to a listserv of the Muslim Students Association. I was trying to interview, the FBI was, I don't know if anybody remembers this, certainly the students won't remember it, but after 9/11, the FBI decided to interview like some huge number of young Muslim men. They were basically going to interview every Muslim man in America. And the FBI said, oh, this is partly just to find out more about the community or whatever, but the Arab American community, Muslim American community was pretty freaked out by this, and they thought it was, really racial profiling and a witch hunt and whatever. So I really wanted to listen in on some of the interviews. I thought that was the only way we're going to figure out what these interviews really are. So I thought I would try to find any group of young Muslim men I could to try to see if they would. Anyway, I wrote this email to this listserv and just requesting access to people, to try to introduce me to people. So I wrote in the email, I addressed the email Salam Alaikum, and I signed it like peace or something. And this was seized on as a sign of my self-hating anti-Zionism. This email that I wrote in 2001 because I wrote Salam Alaikum to a bunch of Muslim students. I don't know, it seems insane to me. Okay, sorry, what was your question again? It was about preparing. Preparing, right, okay. I wrote an email in 2001, that's how I prepared. Anyway, no, so I came to one of the things that was a little crazy about this is I'm really a generalist. My career, I've moved around on a lot of different things. I've done a little heavy politics and education, but really I've done a lot of different things. And that's kind of, I really believe in that, and the New York Times really believes in that kind of a good journalist who with a pen and a pad of paper who asks good questions and sees important details, can go anywhere and write good stories about it. The Fresh Eyes School of Journalism is what we call it. It's a particularly steep hill going to a place where so many things have been written by the 480 or whatever foreign journalists, and not only that, but the academics and the book writers, and I mean, there's so much has been written about this conflict by true experts over many years. So I ordered a bunch of those books on Amazon, and I haven't read most of them. And I met with a bunch of people. I had about 2 months before I went over, 3 months, and I met with a bunch of people who are involved, academics and activists on both sides. And I brushed up a little bit on my Hebrew. which I kind of had a lot of Hebrew from growing up. But what I didn't do, and this is, I'm talking now mainly to the students. So I first got interested in this job. I first thought about taking this job in 2011. January of 2011, I kind of raised my hand for it. And at the time, we thought that my predecessor, Ethan, was going to leave that summer. And my bosses were really interested in me going. But then Ethan decided that he wasn't going to go that summer. He was going to go the next summer. And so they kind of put the thing on ice and said, you know, we can't decide in advance. And a little bit because of that and a lot because of other things that had gone on at the paper, I was really mad. And so I decided that I wouldn't read anything about the Middle East or study Arabic until until they gave me the job, kind of thing, which was really immature. And so then they gave me the job a year later and said, we'd like you to go, tomorrow, essentially. And so I didn't have any time to study Arabic. And the people who I was angry at are not affected by my lack of Arabic. I am the person who is affected. So I wish I'd spent a year and a half studying Arabic instead of being mad that they didn't commit earlier to give me the job. So anyway, but otherwise, I just, I didn't have a lot of time to prepare, but I just tried to read what I could. And mostly, I'm a big believer in reporting. So what I do is I, talk to 3 or 4 times as many people as get quoted in every story and just try to learn as much as I can each story. When I first got there, I just really wrote everything I could see. Because I figured that was how I would prepare for the bigger pieces, was to just kind of write as much as I could and go wherever I could and just kind of file. Yeah.
I have a question in a similar vein, I guess. I was wondering, you spoke a lot about the cyclical nature of a lot of the stories you report on. So what did you find most surprising about actually going there based on what you expected versus reality?
People ask me that a lot. I haven't yet to come up with a good answer about it. Let's see. The first thing I think I found surprising, and I sometimes think about this as, if aliens were to land here and hear that there was this big conflict and then they land, and what would they think? I think the first thing they'd think is, there's plenty of land here, what are they fighting about? So I think I knew already that it wasn't really about land, but I think the extent to which that is really obvious physically when you're kind of driving around, and then when you start to understand that it's if it's not about that, what is it about, and that it's all about these narratives, I think I kind of knew that in an intellectual sense, but I kind of feel it much more now. At first, I was quite surprised at how, at the sort of extent to which most Israelis were totally detached from this issue, but that's changed somewhat since the peace talks started again. I've been actually surprised. Everyone told me I wouldn't need Hebrew at all, and that everyone speaks English, and I've been surprised at how much Israelis want to speak Hebrew and somewhat how little some of them speak English. I was really surprised. This is a little bit embarrassing, I didn't know this, but I find the tribalism within Israel to be quite striking. And one of the things that I still kind of can't believe is they have 4 separate public school systems there, a religious state school system, a secular state school system, an ultra-Orthodox school system, and an Arab school system. So it's a society in which everyone goes to school with the people who are most like them, which I think kind of tells you everything you need to know. What else? I didn't remember how cold it gets in Jerusalem in the evenings in the summer. The weather in Jerusalem is just amazing. Other things that have surprised me. I said this earlier in the class. You constantly, as you report something out, just realize how deeply screwed up it is. It's just a place with just the extent to which the conflict is intractable, the extent to which various situations, like the Bedouin situation, is just overwhelmingly screwed up by the politics. It's just really constantly find yourself up against this kind of wall of insanity. And I guess What else? What else has been surprising? I don't know. Let me think about it while I answer other questions. Yeah. Oh, we have time for just one more question. Okay, put up your hands and I'll, not you, sorry. Why don't you guys both ask your questions and I'll see if I can combine the answer.
I'm not sure. Depends on your question, I guess. But you mentioned that the overshadowing of Jerusalem by the other regional factors that have happened, especially in the last 2 years. And I guess I'm just wondering what you think the impact of that is on the actual conflict.
Okay. Dive in.
I was wondering what, besides the conflict, what you think would be the most important issues that you're reporting on or in general?
Okay. So I think the regional situation has had basically two big effects. One is that, especially before Kerry restarted the peace talks, but to some extent still, that the world's attention is focused elsewhere. The Arab countries are focused elsewhere, focused on their own problems. People have really lost patience to some extent with this conflict. And I think the extent to which this used to be at the core of the regional story just isn't true anymore. And that could work either way in terms of what it might mean for the conflict. Some people definitely think that while fewer people are paying attention or care, it could be easier to resolve. I don't know, we'll see. The other way it really plays into things is that it really has Israelis totally freaked out about security and also totally even less confident about about the idea of a Palestinian state being, a healthy democracy that would, be a good neighbor. So I think there's a real hunker down and wait it out kind of mentality that's taking more hold. There's been sort of two camps about how the regional turmoil should affect things. One camp was, with all this chaos, we need peace more than ever. And the other camp was, wake me when it's over kind of thing. And I think the wake me when it's over is taking a little more strength. The other stories I think are really interesting. I mean, I think this struggle over what Jewishness is going to mean in a Jewish state is just endlessly fascinating. And the economic questions and there's sort of two ways this plays out. I mean, the question of what should happen to the ultra-Orthodox in terms of integrating into the workforce and the society is a big question. The extent to which the secular, now plurality, but almost majority, has embraced orthodoxy as the Judaism that they don't practice is kind of interesting and important. And the extent to which, the sort of Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox's hold on public spaces and on family law, I think is something that is really odd in a Western democracy and may increasingly be challenged. This is a country where something like a third of couples don't get married because they don't want to get married through the Rabbanut, and that's their only option. And that feels, I will say that this was something that I was really interested in when I kind of learned it when I was preparing for the job. And I thought, oh wow, they are gearing up for a crisis on this marriage thing. And not happening. Nothing's changed. There's a lot of, there's a few kind of people who care about that issue and who are trying to bring it up, but I don't think it's any different than it was 10 years ago. But I think those are, the question of how the role of Jewish law in the state and who gets to interpret Jewish law, who's in control of the public space. I think that is a right debate. One of the things that I think is really worth watching is the city of Beit Shemesh, which is a kind of bedroom community halfway between Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. And it's doubled in size in the last, 10 years or something. All Haredi growth. The Beit Shemesh was the place where at the end of 2011, there was this flashpoint of this little girl, very religious girl, who got spit on by ultra-Orthodox protesters for not dressing modestly, even though she was dressed extremely modestly. And anyway, there was, in the elections, the municipal elections that were in October, there was a secular candidate running against the Haredi mayor. And it was a very close election. And it really galvanized this community that had supported this little girl and that had tried to push back these protests. It was a very close election. The secular guy lost. There was accusations of corruption, and they've just ordered a new election for, I think, about less than a month from now. So it'll be very interesting to see what happens there. I think that's kind of an interesting, I don't know, window into that whole issue. All right, well, thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate it. And thank you for reading us.
The World Beyond the Headlines lecture series is a project of the University of Chicago Center for International Studies. Our nationally recognized programming is made possible with support from the Norman Waite Harris Memorial Fund. Download recordings of other events and learn more about the World Beyond the Headlines series at the Center for International Studies website, cis.uchicago.edu.